Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
No, my dear. No, nothing romantic ever happened to me but no, that wasn't romantic either, my Uncle Abraham answered me. But I was romantic. To me, I being 18, romance was the world. My Uncle Abraham was old and lame. His eyes were looking at a portrait, and my own eyes noticed it. It was a miniature that hung at his elbow chair's right hand, a portrait of a woman, whose loveliness even the miniature painter's art had been powerless to disguise, a woman with large shining eyes and perfect oval face. I rose to look at it. I had looked at it 100 times. Often enough in my baby days I had asked, "Who's that, Uncle?" always receiving the same answer, "A lady who died long ago, my dear." My uncle always said. As I looked again at the picture, I asked, "Was she like this?" "Who?" asked Uncle. Your romance," I replied. Uncle Abraham looked hard at me. "Yes," he said at last. "Very, very like." I sat down on the floor by him. "Won't you tell me about her?" "There's nothing to tell," he said. "I think it was fancy, mostly, and foolish, but it's the realest thing that happened in my long life, my dear." A long pause. I kept silence. We should always be patient with old people. They like to speak slowly. "I remember," he said in the dreamy tone always promising so well to the ear, that a story sounded delightful. "I remember, when I was a young man, I was very lonely indeed. I never had a sweetheart. I was always lame and could not walk properly, and the girls used to laugh at me." He sighed. Then he went on. "And so I decided to spend my time alone in lonely places, and one of my favorite walks was up through our churchyard, which was set high on a hill in the middle of the marsh country. I liked that because I never met anyone there. It's all over, years ago. I was a silly boy. Well, I used to go and sit all by myself in the churchyard, which was always had a sweet smell of thyme plant. After sitting there for a long time, it became dark. I used to watch the bats flying around the red light, and wonder why God didn't make everyone's legs straight and strong. But by the time the light was gone I had always worked it off, so to speak, and could go home quietly and say my prayers without any bitterness. Well, one hot night in August, when I had watched the sunset fade and the crescent moon grow golden, I was just stepping over the low stone wall of the churchyard when I heard a sound behind me. I turned round, expecting it to be a rabbit or a bird. It was a woman. He looked at the portrait. So did I. "Yes," he said, "that was her very face." I was a bit scared and said something, I don't know what, and she laughed and said, "Did I think she was a ghost?" And I answered back, and I stayed talking to her over the churchyard wall till it was quite dark, and the glowworms were out in the wet grass all along the way home. Next night I saw her again, and the next night and the next. Always at twilight time. Again my uncle paused. "It's very long ago," he said slowly, "and I'm an old man, but I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was always lame, and the girls used to laugh at me." I don't know how long it went on. You don't measure time in dreams, but at last your grandfather said I looked as if I had 1 foot in the grave, and he would be sending me to stay with one of our relatives. I had to go. I could not tell my father why I would rather had died than go. What was her name, uncle? I asked. She never would tell me her name, and why should she? I had names enough in my heart to call her by. Marriage? My dear, even then I knew marriage was not for me. But I met her night after night, always in our churchyard. It was there we always met and always parted. The last time was the night before I went away. She was very sad, and dearer than life itself. And she said, "If you come back before the new moon, I shall meet you here just as usual. But if the new moon shines on this grave and you are not here, you will never see me again anymore." She laid her hand on the yellow lichen tomb against which we had been leaning. It was an old weather-worn stone, and bore on it the inscription, Susanna Kingsnorth, died in 1713. I shall be here. I said. I mean it, she said, with deep and sudden seriousness, it is no fancy. You will be here when the new moon shines? I promised, and after a while we parted. I had been with my relatives for nearly a month. I was to go home on the next day, when, turning over a case in the parlor, I came upon that miniature. I could not speak for a minute. At last I said, with dry tongue, and heart beating to the tune of heaven and hell, "Who is this?" "That," said my aunt. "Oh." She was engaged to one of our family members many years ago, but she died before the wedding. They say she was a bit of a witch. A beautiful one, wasn't she? I looked again at the face, the lips, the eyes of my dear and lovely love, whom I was to meet tomorrow night when the new moon shone on that tomb in our churchyard. "Did you say she was dead?" I asked, and I hardly knew my own voice. "Years and years ago. Her name's on the back and her date." I took the portrait from its faded red velvet bed, and read on the back, Susanna Kingsnorth, died in 1713. That was in 1813. My uncle stopped short. "What happened?" I asked breathlessly. "I believe I had a shock," my uncle answered slowly. "At any rate, I was very ill." "And you missed the new moon on the grave?" "I missed the new moon on the grave." "And you never saw her again?" "I never saw her again." "But, uncle, do you really believe? Can a dead woman be with you and talk with you? Was she real or she was a ghost?" My uncle took out his pipe and filled it. "It's a long time ago," he said, "a many, many years. Old man's tales, my dear. Old man's tales. Don't you take any notice of them?" He lighted the pipe, puffed silently a moment or two, and then added, "But I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was lame, and the girls used to laugh at me.